Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's RAPS webcast, Update Your Medical Device UDI Data and Labels, this year's FDA Class 1, next year EU MDR. My name's Alex Aiken, and I'll be your host for today's event. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our presenters for today, Gary Sainer and Lee Patty. Gary Sainer is a subject matter expert on medical device unique device identification and other structured content reporting to regulatory agencies and commercial organizations. He has over 30 years of experience in software development, process management, and data administration, with the last 15 years focused on the life sciences industry. With an understanding of regulations, business requirements, and systems, he has helped implement solutions at ReadTech for data management, validation, and processing of drug labeling and medical device unique device identification content. He serves as co-chair of the industry's structured product labeling technical team on the advisory board of the Medical Devices Group. Lee Patty is Vice President and General Manager at NiceLabel Americas, where he oversees the company's sales, project delivery, and operations in the Americas. Over his 25-year career, Lee has worked with life sciences companies to improve their labeling processes while meeting industry regulation requirements. Prior to NiceLabel, he co-founded NiceWare International LLC, a NiceLabel distributor where he was responsible for marketing, healthcare product development, and professional services. NiceLabel acquired NiceWare into 2013 and added Lee to the global executive team. Lee has 25 years of AIDC industry experience. Now, without further ado, I'll turn things over to Lee and Gary.
Well, thank you very much, Alex, and want to welcome everyone to the webinar today. Let's get this screen up here that we want to go over. As we had discussed, we'll be going over the changes that you need to make to your labeling to comply with UDI compliance here in the FDA and also in the EU next year. Just for your reference, there's my and Lee's contact or the titles. Today, the bulk of the time will be spent on some of the requirements and solutions for those. We'll give a little bit of a background in the beginning about the two companies to let you know who are hosting the particular webinar today. And we'll also go over some basic requirements for the data reporting and the labeling. And Lee then will be taking a look at the remote cloud-based labeling and also strategy for UDI labeling compliance. I want to welcome my co-presenter, Lee from NiceLabel, and thank you for joining us, Lee, and hopefully we'll be able to cover a lot of different aspects of labeling as well as the data reporting requirements and have a beneficial webinar for all. So with all that, let's get started on a little bit of review of the two companies. ReadTech is a company that provides best-in-class information-based solutions and services to the life sciences industry. We have a long-standing history going back to 1961, currently over 1,000 employees with offices here in Horsham, PA, where I'm located in the U.S. Also, we have offices in Virginia, just south of Washington, D.C., and in Leiden in the Netherlands. Going back to 1970, we have a contract with the United States Patent Office. I mention that because that is where we started our roots in processing data and databases and XML content and so on. And that's a long-standing contract. We're actually celebrating a 50-year anniversary this year. More relevant to this particular audience, we have been serving the medical device and pharmaceutical sector, currently over 1,000 clients in that particular area. And we position ourselves between the manufacturer and health authorities for submitting those required regulatory documents, and also between the manufacturers and their customers and trading partners, handling the data, processing the data, and making sure that it's able to be transferred in correct fashion. There's a number of associations that we're connected with there at the bottom that we keep a very close watch on and attend meetings frequently to keep update on the various late-breaking news. We've been very fortunate in the medical device space to submit over 530,000 SBL records to the FDA GUDID database. That represents over 31% of all electronic submissions. So been very fortunate and glad to serve the industry in making those submissions to the FDA. Lee, I'm going to ask you to give a couple words of description about NiceLabel.
Thanks, Gary. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on where you're coming from. Thank you for attending. A little bit about NiceLabel. NiceLabel, at a glance, we've been in business for over 25 years, 27 to be exact. We're recognized as one of the leaders in label lifecycle management software by companies like IDC and Gartner. We're a full solution service provider. So it means what we do is we develop a platform. We deliver professional services to implement projects, and then we also deliver post-sale support, post-implementation support on a 24/7, 365 global basis with some of the world's largest companies. Next slide, Gary. And just on some of the companies, I mean, this is really a list, kind of a short list of life sciences companies and medical device companies that we've worked with. We look at the medical device industry in general is kind of undergoing this digital transformation and really being driven by regulation. So 21 CFR Part 11, FDA, the UDI, the EU MDR. All of these things drive change and drive compliance inside of the organizations. So when you look at beyond the regulations, you look to digitally transform a labeling process or any business process that you have inside of your companies. What we look for is really how do we help our customers, as an example, uncover some of the hidden costs and hidden problems that they might have in their process and in their workflow. Because we always say when you go through one of these transformations, it's good to look at everything. You may not look at it for another 15 years. So why modernize old process if you can actually create new process that works with current regulations and then put technology on top of it so it's not a roadblock. So back to you, Gary.
All right, thank you, Lee. What we'll do now is start off with some of the background information, a global landscape of UDI. Take a look at some of the basics here. I assume most of those in the audience are familiar with UDI, so I'm going to work my way rather quickly through this. Please get back to us if you have questions or pose your questions in chat. And in that way, we'll be able to go over some of the basics with you. But just to set the field today, a UDI is comprised of two components, a device identifier, and that is a required portion. It identifies the label in a particular model or version of a device. The second component is a production identifier, and as some of those controls listed there, manufacturing date, expiration date, lot, batch, serial number, as they appear on the label, they would be required to be included in the production identifier. So they're conditional. If those objects don't appear on the label, then they do not need to be included in the production identifier. So if you merge those two identifiers together, you get the full UDI. In our particular example, we're using GS1 as a illustration purposes here, and that red device identifier merged with those blue numbers for the production identifier make up the full UDI. And in this particular example, you see some codes in parentheses, 0, 1, 11, 17, 10, and so on. Those are particular codes that identify the values that follow per the GS1 standard. Now, how is this number represented? The device identifier is represented first, so that appears there in the red, followed by the production identifier. And in this particular illustration, 4 of those controls are included on the label, so all 4 would be included in the production identifier. And again, there could range from none all the way up to the 4 or anywhere in between. The presentation for automatic identification and data capture, AIDC, is typically implemented as a single dimension barcode in the upper half of the screen, but it can also be represented in a two-dimensional barcode. And again, you look to your standards based on the particular offering and type and symbology that is required. The UDI value is not only represented for computers to use, i.e. the barcode, but also presented in human text form. So the human text appearing below the single barcode above, it can also appear in a stack form on the side of a barcode. And all of this is created and based on various standards that the health authority agencies have approved. Starting with the FDA, they approved 3, GS1, HIBCC, and ICC-BBA. I know it's a mouthful. But the GS1 standard is predominantly the most used standard, so I've used that in my illustrations here. I should also mention the European Commission has approved those 3 standards as well as IFA for use in Europe. Now, before we get too far into this, we do want to realize that there are 2 data flows. There is a data flow that you've been working with for years, the label data that's represented in the lower half of the screen, where information is funneled through a labeling system, that being a NiceLabel perhaps, and then onto the label itself, and then out to the end customer. So the product label and packaging labels have that information on it. What is new about that is the requirement to have UDI or information that complies to UDI on that particular label. So that's a revision, if you will, to your current procedures. If you have not worked with UDI in the past, I understand those Class 3 and Class 2 manufacturers for the U.S. market have a number of years under their belt. But if you're Class 1 and maybe just starting to look at this information new, you would need to create a new data flow that runs through a UDI data system and then is reported to regulatory agencies. Some of your customers may ask for that information in a structured fashion as well, but then that goes out to the public, and that is information that is shared to anyone that has access to those databases. As to the timing of all this, one of the reasons that we scheduled this particular conversation is that this year in September, the US FDA has a requirement to comply with UDI for all the Class 1 products. And as mentioned, some of the previous classes, the high-risk Class 3 and 2, already have been reported and comply. Labels have been updated. But if you're only manufacturing Class 1, this may be very new to you, and you do have the September 24th deadline. Not too long thereafter, a few short months, May, the European Union will have their medical device regulation date of application go into force. And then 2 years later, the in vitro diagnostic regulation date of application go into force. And we do expect some early activity, this actor module, the UDI and device registration module, and certification notified body module to be available early on a voluntary basis. So there is some compliance that you need to be concerned about in following certainly your self-certified Class 1 products and any product that you want to have MDR compliance with. Now, in addition to that, there's a crowded calendar here. There's a number of activities going on in the Netherlands. The National Health Service has requirements for data reporting and label compliance, and it gets even busier. There's Asian health authorities, South Korea, China, and it goes around the world. Saudi Arabia, Australia, UK, Canada, India, and so on. Many of these regulatory bodies have announced or have plans, but have not announced actual dates of implementation yet. It's a crowded calendar. Today, we only have time to talk about these two, the the FDA and the European Union. So with that, Alex, would you be able to run a quick poll question? I think we have 2 questions to gather some information about the audience that we have today.
Sure thing. So the first question we have for everyone is, in what countries do you market your medical devices? So I'm going to launch this real quick, and you should be able to respond to the poll here shortly. So just take a quick moment, respond to this. You can select more than one. Correction, no, you can just select one there. So once we've seen that most of the folks have responded here, we'll close this down and we'll show you the results here. So it looks like mostly, as we're kind of going through here, 52% USA, about 47% EU, and 1% each for China, Saudi Arabia, and South Korea. And for those who are submitting their responses in the questions panel, don't submit them in the questions panel, just click on the actual item on your screen there.
Okay, well, it looks like some of those early results showed FDA and EU market to be very popular.
So we have about 60%.
That lines up with our.
Sorry, go ahead, Gary.
I was just going to say that lines up well with the topic, so that looks like a good alignment.
Okay, so just share with you the results there real quick, and we'll open up the second poll. So we have the results, mostly USA and EU. So we'll hide that again, and we'll ask you here. The next question is, which best describes your preparation for EU MDR and UDI submissions? So we'll launch this again, and again, please just click on the blue screen there on your on the main panel. We can see your results there. Okay, about half of the folks have voted in so far. It looks like 37% are on internal resources, 26% have a plan in place, and 19% have not started. So we'll just give it a few more seconds here. So if anybody else wants to submit, you're more than welcome to. We'll give you about 10 more seconds. All right, so we'll close this down and share the results with you guys. So again, like I said, mostly internal resources describing your preparation for EU MDR and UDI. Second place is plan in place, and lastly, not started was the third most submitted response. Third party help had 11% and need help had 6%. So there we go. If we want to revisit those, Gary, at any time, you're more than welcome. We can just share those again. So there we go.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think what we'll do now is move on to a little bit of a deeper dive into US FDA UDI requirements. There are 4 major areas that the UDI rule put into place. One is to make sure that UDI is placed on the device label and package and presented in both that human readable text that we had looked at earlier and also in a second format, this AIDC, typically a barcode. And then there was some ruling about a date format. There's a subset of devices that need to comply with direct marking. So if they're used for extended use long after the packaging and label has been discarded, they do need to be directly marked with UDI. Typical technology there is laser etching on like a surgical scalpel or something like that. Third major area is reporting the device identifier and number of attributes to the FDA's database where this information is stored. There's various ways to do that. Able to key it in. You can build or develop your own system, or you can basically rent a service using a third party. That's actually where RETEC plays in helping you report that information. And then there's ongoing reporting requirements based around MDR for adverse events, annual reports, post-marketing surveillance, and so on. There are some record compliance relative to 21 CFR, and the 3-year record retention for those devices that are discontinued. Since the Class 1 is coming up, I included a slide with a couple exceptions. If I was a manufacturer of Class 1, I'd first go to the FDA product code database and check my particular FDA product code to see if there's a good manufacturing practice exemption. If that's the case, I have no UDI requirements for that particular device. So there's roughly, last time I checked, somewhere around 20% of those product codes do have a GMP exemption. So that's something worthwhile to check out. So that might relieve you of some of the burden. If my particular device did not have that exception, then you should be aware that all Class 1 devices do not need to have the production identifier. So that's the second portion of that UDI. And if I were to have a Class 1 in the retail business, I may have been using UPC. The good news there is that UPC does qualify to serve as the UDI on the label. And there's no direct marking required for that particular Class 1 retail device with UPC. You do need to report the device identifier and a number of attributes, standard set of attributes to the FDA for those devices. So there's a couple exceptions that you ought to be aware of. This is a list of data fields. The good news is we're not going to talk about every one of those in this session, but various categories there. We have found that it is a little bit of a challenge collecting these, and no historical record is currently available that has all these easily available in nice, concise location. You'll find these in various systems, and it does take a little bit of effort to collect them, make sure there's owners, make sure they're updated and kept current. Total of 64 attributes that are made available to the public. We won't go through every one of these lessons learned, but I'll just highlight two there at the bottom. We have found that some of the hiccups and anomalies that come through are getting the FDA listing number for your actual device. Sometimes it's a little hard to find, and you might have an invalid listing number. And the other code, the Global Medical Device Nomenclature Code, keep a close eye on that. That particular terminology does change over the course of time. It's dynamic. Some codes that you might have had in years past may have now been deprecated and no longer available, and they're replaced by some more granular codes. So many times a submitted code that you it goes into play, and the FDA would reject it because it's no longer active. Some additional lessons learned here on data. These particular three are in a group. Basically, the fields were termed as optional by the FDA. I believe now they would have thought about that and would have preferred to refer to those as conditional, but many submitters took that as a opening to not submit any data, and a lot of these fields were empty. The FDA does ask that these fields be filled in and submitted. You can update previously submitted values in records that may be empty, and you are able to fill those in with additional information. But the feedback from the users of this data was such that they do want this information, the device description and catalog number and so on, and many times it was left off. Good quality records, if you're going through Class 1, make sure you concentrate on these fields, and not that way you don't have to go back and revisit them and do some cleanup. So let's take a quick look at an example. This has a little bit exaggerated barcode for illustration purposes, but very much like we had looked at earlier. Usually the challenge here is finding real estate to place a UDI in a particular label. Sometimes real estate is a real problem finding space. I will also show a Class 1 UPC. Now this is a particular label, and again, it does have to follow the date format, so any dates do need to follow that year, month, day, day. And the actual barcode is much shorter. So remember, there's no production identifier, and this particular code uses UPC, 12 characters, so it's conforms to UPC, and it does allow you, if you had been using UPC, to just maybe check your date format and go forward with minimal change on the label design. So that's a quick summary of the requirements for the FDA. We're going to switch now over to the European Union. The major areas there are pretty much in parallel to what we had looked at the FDA. So there's a requirement to put that UDI again, the full UDI on the device label and packaging, and present it in the Huber readable plain text and through a barcode technology. They do have this subset of products that are reusable and need to have permanent marking. The reporting of the information is to a European database, and actually the attributes are well over 2 times the size of the FDA collections data set. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. And there are some reporting requirements as well. So these 4 tenets that EU has are somewhat parallel, subtle differences, but for the most part, the concept is the same. The particulars in many cases are different. For example, the patient implant card does now need to include a UDI. There's no equivalent exactly of the patient implant card in the US. One thing I need to talk about is maybe refresh some of the timing. So originally, the MDR data application was in concert with the UDI launch in May of 2020 of this year. But there was this announcement from the European Commission of a 1-year delay of that date of application. So that kind of shifted everything out 1 year. Otherwise, would be having a little bit more urgent discussion today. The UDI launch was also delayed. There was some transfer of ownership and some slow development, if you will, on UDI. They wanted to do some additional testing and so on. Anyway, 2 years were allotted for that additional time. And one thing that has not changed was the date of application for the IVDR. With those times in place, we expect an 18-month period where legacy devices, those that are certified under a directive and continue to be marketed after the date of application, those MDR compliant devices and those in vitro diagnostic compliant devices all have this 18-month window starting on May 2022 and running out to November 2023. Now, there may be some early implementations where device labels need to show UDI based on this date of application, but the registration of the actual data is this 18-month window. Recently, the European Commission mentioned that there would be early releases of a few of the modules in the UDI database. So the actor module is expected now to be operational in March 2021, and then shortly thereafter, May 21, the device registration and UDI module, as well as the certification or the certificates and the notified body module would be voluntarily available starting in May 2021. So the good news about that is you're able to receive a single registration number by making use of this actor module, and then you have some voluntary submissions that you're able to make early on, actually a year before it would be actually required. The data that needs to be reported to the European Union on each device is divided into 2 levels. There's a family level, which is common for many devices in that family, and there's 36 items that need to be reported. And these particular common fields are grouped under the name of a basic UDI DI. You might hear the term buddy UDI, and that refers to this particular category of a family. And these are common fields, the certificate number, legislation, risk class, and so on, number of characteristics there. But for each of these families, there can be 1 or more devices under those families, and they are linked together. But at the device level, there's 66 fields that are recorded for that particular device. As to the label requirements, there's a number of label requirements listed in the medical device regulation and also in the IVDR. This is just a partial list. I'll highlight the electronic instruction for use, the new medical device symbol, and UDI. This particular image shows those on a particular fictitious label. And thank you, NICE, for supplying this particular example. But you'll need to make sure that for UDI compliant, this MD and this rectangle is included for those medical devices. I expect much more frequent use of linking information back to electronic information for use. And then required would be this new item where UDI would need to be presented, in this particular example, a barcode with the values attached to the side of that. So I think what we'll do now is we did a review of the FDA requirements, the European Union requirements. Let's turn our attention over how you might implement a solution and put a particular system or strategy in place that addresses meeting those particular requirements in a timely fashion. And I'm going to ask Lee now to go over some of the topics that he has prepared. So let's pass the control over to Lee. All right. Looks like it's coming through. Go ahead, Lee.
Good. Thanks, Gary. So, Gary, he did a great job of telling us all about the regulations, kind of what's coming down the pipe. What we also wanted to do is kind of focus a little bit on where Gary focused on the content of the label and the regulations itself. Ultimately, you have to put these systems, that label has to go into production, has to fit into your production process at some point. So we wanted to take some time during this presentation to even just talk a little bit about how now that you've designed the label, now you have it approved, you're submitted, how do you make this work inside of your operations? Further to that, we actually wanted to make it a little bit more contemporary and maybe focus it around our adjusted normal or new normal, whatever you'd like to call it, around COVID-19 and the whole shift to remote, the remote work and limited work, distancing, things like that, and how that impacts your business. So one of the things we'd like to do is kind of look at, if we look at the kind of some of the challenges, right? So some of you may have directly been involved in the COVID-19 response. For you, time is of the essence. You need to get your products to the front lines faster. You're managing supply chain, supply and demand. And while for some of you demand is up, you have to figure out how to fulfill orders with less on-site staff, people working in new ways. And labeling and UDI are a big part of this, obviously, because of the regulations. But we all know, I think, on this call that labeling is one of the greatest sources of products in the market for medical devices. So no matter what the challenge ahead of us, whether it's COVID or anything else, we still have to have good solid systems in place that deliver on the regulation itself. So as Gary mentioned, the date of application for MDR has been postponed to May 2021. And this allows some of the member states and health institutions and economics operators to kind of prioritize the fight against the coronavirus pandemic. So for some medical device manufacturers scrambling to meet the 2020 deadline, this provides a little bit of a reprieve that you can use to time to kind of examine your labeling, your process, all those things. Is it easy for everyone to use? Can it adapt to pandemic-driven shift to remote working? Now more than ever, many manufacturers, life sciences or otherwise, can benefit from more modernized technologies that enable. We're doing more webinars now, right? These are just modernized technologies in the way we've shifted our work. So how can we turn those challenges into benefits for our business? You know, when we look at label management systems, and we'll describe a little bit about what a label management system is and how it's going to help in get that label that Gary was telling you about onto your products and out the door. Cloud technologies, as an example, is one of those ways that it makes it easy for you to meet your regulatory guidelines and your requirements, regardless of where you are or your suppliers. Our remote access to labeling allows you to deploy labeling to your various sites, your various business partners. You may have contract manufacturers, relabelers, repackagers that also need to have compliant labeling. The ability to do something quickly through the cloud enables you to synchronize all those different stakeholders in your business while still getting consistency out of your labeling, out of your master data. In smaller medical device manufacturers, what we see with less IT resource and infrastructure certainly will benefit from some of this. And what we see even with a lot of class ones, a lot of smaller medical device manufacturers that need to get their products out there, and they're trying to comply, but they don't have a lot of IT staff. They don't have a lot of infrastructure. So something like this is actually really kind of helps them move much faster in their implementations. So if you look at some of the, something as simple as addressing the humanitarian need, right? So we're helping to increase speed and agility by having technologies that are faster to deploy and easier to manage, all the way down to consistent labeling as your products move through your supply chain. Can you go from catching errors to preventing errors? Right? And that's a key point, that when you're laying out process and you're laying out your the business requirements for how you would implement the label that Gary was talking about, a lot of companies put into play, or they've had historically, process in place to catch errors. And the ideal scenario is really to prevent those errors. Can you actually build process? Can you reevaluate the process that you have today and prevent errors rather than working to catch errors? There's always going to have to be a QA process in place that's going to have to catch something, but the ideal scenario is that we're going to prevent errors rather than catching them, right? And above all, UDI compliance, it has to be maintained and balanced while getting your products to market faster. So if we look at some of the compliance using a cloud system, label management system for compliance, the idea is around increasing your accuracy, easing your label changes, access from anywhere. If you think about where legacy technologies are today, you may have a process in place today for labeling. Some of those costs and some of the management nightmares that you have with the legacy process may be very apparent to you. Some may not, right? So what we typically would see is a lot of legacy processes, a lot of them will have a heavy IT involvement. So even simple label designs may have heavy IT involvement with the design. So everything that Gary just showed you, it's either going to be maybe marketing or the art department, or it's going to be IT. In many cases, IT is designing those labels. They may have to custom code those labels rather than simply design them. So the ideal scenario is to move from that legacy over to a more of a transformation, in that digital transformation, by empowering the business users to manage label formats. Can we actually replace IT involvement, which can bring about its own delays? IT resources are very stretched these days. It's not always easy to get them to focus on a label change. Can we empower more business users to actually do that with a very simple way to actually design label formats? Can we replace things like in your quality department, your paper-based quality checks? A lot of paper-based when we're dealing with companies out in the market. A lot of very legacy paper-based QA systems and how they're moving around approvals and that sort of thing. And can we move that to a digital quality control system that gives you much more visualization, pictures worth 1,000 words sort of thing. And then approving data and label layouts separately, right? can you actually move that to more or less something that's more of a variant? There's various terms, but like a variant, or freezing a label format so that actually can be separated from your master data and approved separately. Making sure that you're integrating with your master data. You've got a single source of truth for your master data. Making sure that you're integrated to all of your third parties, your stakeholders. So you may have, again, relabelers, contract manufacturers. Chances are, if you give a drawing of a label to 10 different contract manufacturers, you're going to get 10 different labels back. So the idea is, can you actually use the same label asset that you've designed for your own internal use, distribute that out to your third parties, and get the same label back where you couldn't even tell the difference between the two, right? And that's the goal. And then essentially, if you've got disparate systems out there, there's validation process, there's a whole bunch of different things that have to go into making sure that those things are going to production, and you really consolidate those things. Okay, so if we look at some of the benefits of a standardized strategy and a centralized strategy for UDI label compliance, what we see is, we'll kind of go over what a label management system is. So a label management system is really, it's a number of components that make up a workflow or a process on how you're going to actually get a label, the label that Gary showed you, how you're going to get it designed, how are you going to get it routed through your organization so it can be approved, and then ultimately, how are you going to produce it when you need to produce it, and produce it with the right label at the right time, with the right product and the right quantities, all of the above. So if we look at the components, right, we can break it really down into three discrete areas: design, management, and printing. So if you look at design, rather than having IT code label formats that are going to go to a variety of different printers, more of a consolidated, simple to use. Can you, if you can design a PowerPoint presentation, you should be able to design a label, right? I mean, that's really the principle here, to try to make it as simple as possible so that it's very visual in the design and the layout. And then you've got a management system. Can you put the label into a management system, route into a workflow where you may have 2 or 3 levels of approvals of a label before it actually goes into production, and you want to track all of that, right? You want to make sure that you've got electronic signatures on everything. It's all very digitally traced. You've got clear ownership and handoff of all of your label assets and datas and imagery and all the things, logos that would go on there, that it's all very controlled. And then ultimately printing. Printing can take on a number of different forms. You could do manual printing. And so as an example, for your third-party suppliers, you may push out the same label format that you designed around what Gary had showed you. You need to print that in 2 different areas. You need to print that in your own processes, integrated with your own business systems, whether it's your PLM system or your manufacturing systems. You need to integrate there, but you also need to send that same format with maybe compartmentalized data to a third-party manufacturer so that they can print. And you need to reuse that same label asset, but you need to get it and print it in different ways. Those are the considerations that should really be taken as to how a label asset's going to be implemented and used in your organization. Because ultimately, you're still, even if a third party's doing it, you're likely still responsible for the label itself. So you want to make sure you give yourself the best chance to have a compliant label with compartmentalized and controlled data that you can get. Then ultimately, we're gonna basically use the printers that you have in your estate, in your production, whether those are thermal label printers or laser printers or direct mark inkjet printers. We're going to use those devices, and we're going to output that label format to a variety of different output devices. So that's really kind of the key components of a label management system, and essentially what you would see in the high-level workflow as to how something would flow through your organizational label asset. And then ultimately, the way it's deployed. You can deploy it either inside of your own data centers, your own infrastructure. You could actually do it in your own private cloud. So many life sciences companies, from a security standpoint, like to have their own private clouds. Or you can actually deploy it in a public cloud, So if you've got, I'm sure all of us subscribe to different services that are in a public cloud. Microsoft Office 365, right? Public cloud type of implementation. We all kind of grab it from the same place probably. So there's different ways that you can go about doing it. There could be a hybrid approach in how we would implement it as well. But that's essentially, as your company's looking for this, you can understand what is the best for your business, and any provider that's going to help you with this should be able to walk you through and give you some best practices as to what is the best implementation. Is it a hybrid? Is it one of these? What works best for your business? And your business is different than the next person's business. Probably 70% of it's the same, but it's that 30% that we really need to focus on and make sure that it really fits into your business. Okay, so we look at just back to the label design itself. So again, what Gary had shown you and really give us great details around what the content of the label, the compliance on the label itself. Now you have to get that label designed, and that the design of that label, again, shouldn't be an arduous process. It shouldn't be something that IT has to go and start writing source code to actually generate. These things are living, breathing animals. They change frequently. There needs to be a lot of flexibility and speed around how it's designed and how it's approved so that we can get it into production in a controlled manner. So essentially, if you're looking for a UDI compliant label design, you really want to choose something that's going to help you save time and free up that costly IT resource. If we can get the business users, and whether that is somebody in quality or somebody in manufacturing or even somebody in the art department, to go in and look at the label designs and design the label designs, there should be a very easy to use tool to visually lay that out, right? To make those changes quickly, consolidate your label designs. You don't, if you've got 3,000 SKUs, you probably don't need 3,000 different label formats. You might, but there's an opportunity there for a consolidation strategy to help streamline your business. Then if we look at quality, if the kind of a digitized workflow, I mentioned that before, a digitized workflow, changing from a paper-based to more visual digital workflow, something that helps with routing a label format that others can see, click on, somebody can go and look through 2 revisions of a label, see some visual comparisons. Again, picture's worth 1,000 words. So can we actually see some of those visual comparisons and really understand quickly what's changed from version to version of a label? This is really a digitalization of the quality process, and typically with most QA folks, very well appreciated, because again, it's much more, you get an email with a link and you click on it, it opens it up, much better than a paper-based process, all while recording signatures and electronically recording everything that you're doing with the label itself. So definitely another consideration in how you're doing label lifecycle management with a label management system. And then really, if we look at the idea that if you're going to have a lot of SKUs and you're going to have a lot of data, you may need to do a certain approval process. And this changes from company to company, but the principles are the same. Mass changes and approvals, you need to be done as quickly as possible. If something changes in your master data, you want to make sure that you can get that across all your label formats quickly and get them approved, get them through the quality process. So the idea of integrating with master data that we can merge with a label template, then we can kind of lock down that template, different terms for it, right? It's a frozen label, it's a variant, there's a lot of different things that customers call it, but essentially you're freezing probably 95% of that label format with the product level data. And what you're left with is something that might have some production level data, DI data, PI data, that right before production, when it's entered in, or it comes from the MES, or it's entered in from QA, you can do a quick quality check on it, record the quality check, and now you can actually go into production. So it really streamlines the approval process and in getting label formats, making changes to master data, disconnecting that from master data so that if you change it again, it doesn't upset your approved label. And then in production, we can look at production level data and approve that and go. And then on integration, we want to make sure that we're integrating to all of our critical business systems and master data. So a lot of times what we'll see in the market is, essentially you've got product data coming from a PLM, but you've got production level data coming from a manufacturing execution system. So essentially that's an aggregation of data from multiple systems that happen at different times. So you may have the PLM data coming in to your template, we freeze that, and then at production time, the MES data is implemented, and it's a last minute quality check to make sure that that label is ready to go to production. And that integration should be able to happen to cloud business systems, on-premise business systems, SAP, that sort of thing. Doesn't matter where the data sits. Then if we move to third-party labeling, third-party label is really your suppliers. We have on the suppliers themselves, can you onboard new suppliers quickly? Can you guarantee the label accuracy that you're going to give them? I mean, the one thing again, like I said, if you give a drawing of a label format to 10 different suppliers, you're probably going to get 10 different labels back. So the idea is, can we actually spoon feed, so to speak, the supplier, the contract manufacturer, the external location, the label, the approved label with approved data, so that they're forced to produce the same thing that you would produce inside your own four walls. And that's really what from an ideal supply chain, that gives us our label accuracy and our compliance. It allows us to onboard suppliers quickly because we're not leaving that to them. All we're doing is saying, print this, put it on the product and go. And we're doing this without massive IT resources, right? We're centralizing our supply chain management. And if we look at validation, from validation standpoint, all systems are going to have to be validated. So the idea is, and nobody's really crazy about validation, but it has to happen. So it's necessary for life sciences companies. You have to basically go through and do 3 different levels of qualification for your software systems: installation qualification, operational qualification, production qualification. So what you've got is, if you can shorten the time on part of that process, minimizing costs by maybe streamlining IQ and OQ. PQ is going to be something that really is specific to your environment. But essentially, if we can streamline the IQ and the OQ process, that gets a validated system happening quicker, so less cost, faster into production, and definitely it's an ease of a process that it can be difficult at times. So just to summarize before we hand it back, again, when we look at the benefits of a globalized, centralized, and standardized label strategy, the idea of consolidating label templates into dynamic smart templates, faster processing of change requests, right? We've had companies that tell us it takes us 8 weeks to get a label change. Can you move that down to days instead of weeks? Much cost savings there, get products to market faster, improve revenue as well. Can we do seamless integration with your existing business systems for a single source of truth without basically having too many different systems doing too many manual things at once? And then really a global labeling tool that can support a standardized labeling process. Saving time with your resources, maybe with digitized QA rather than manual QA, and then ultimately significantly lower your risk of errors. Can we prevent errors rather than catching errors? So that's all that I have. I think we're going to go into a Q&A session now.
Alrighty. So yeah, unfortunately, we don't have quite as much time to go through as many questions as we have here, but we'll try our best here. So we'll start here at the top. This question is for Gary. It asks, will you be addressing direct part marketing at all? 3.5 of Part C of Annex 5 raises questions for me. If I have a lot number and a manufacturer date on my label, must the manufacturer date be a part of the UDI PI?
Yeah, so that's a good question. There are some special scenarios regarding what needs to be included in the PI. Unfortunately, off the top of my head, I don't remember. There's some special scenarios also for active implant, serial number being required. If the item is not an active implant, then I believe it's a serial number or a lot number. So on that particular one, Alex, I think we'll get back to that, do a little additional research on that Part C section, and then get back to them.
Alrighty. Okay, moving along here. Next question asks, can you discuss any exemptions for Class 1 UDI?
Yeah, so on page 16, we did go over some of the exceptions that the FDA offers for Class 1, those being a good manufacturing practice, fully exempted from UDI, and the other requirement that, or the other exemption being that all Class 1 devices do not need a production identifier portion, no matter what the case. And then there is this provision for using a UPC symbol as the device identifier, and it satisfies the full requirements of UPC. Just make sure that you do the device product registration as well, but you may not have to change a label that already has UPC on it.
Alrighty. Another question here we have, FDA allows rework of existing labels to deplete our inventory. Is it sufficient to print only the GTIN barcode on small label? It says here, including human readable and product code, and affixed to the current label. If you need to, I can read that again.
Yeah, it's my understanding that you can add a separate standalone label to and make it nearby, not something different, like on the back side, or where the other labels on the front should be located nearby, can be on a separate label. Lee, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you covered it well. I think ultimately the output, if there's a rework, your label management system, definitely you could have rework labels. There's variants that you could do there as well, so it'd be easy to do.
Okay.
Alrighty. This one is on expiration date formats. Is there any requirement in terms of format in the EU? And it asks if year, month, and day format is okay.
Yeah, so I think there was another question related to this as well, Alex, but what you'll find is that the date presentation on the actual label as a standalone object needs to conform to the year dash month dash day. So it does include days. When you encode that date into the UDI, you need to follow the particular standards that you're adhering to. So GS1 actually has a presentation of the date, which is slightly different. First of all, it removes the dashes and uses a 2-digit year. So simply year, month, day. And that does cause some confusion where you present the date as a standalone object in one format, and yet when you code it in the UDI, the health authorities defer to the particular standard of how you code that, and it's most commonly used only as a 2-digit year with no dashes.
Okay, and I think we have time for at least one more question here, so I'll ask this one briefly. Asks, we manufacture a medical device that is classified as Class 1 in the US and Class 2A in the EU. Is it possible to design one label that would work for both markets?
Yeah, I would think so. G10s are universal if you use, and actually all the numbers that the standards and encoding that is generated by the standards organization need to be universal and able to be accepted globally. You might find some regional differences with the label and therefore additional requirements. Obviously, if it's an import into EU, you need to add the EC rep and have a CE mark and that sort of thing, where obviously that label does not have those particular items when sold, or not necessary to have those items when it's sold in the US. So regional differences may have additional requirements. Some companies are able to be very creative and have a common label. And Lee, I think you might be able to speak a little bit more to this.
Yeah, so I think that's really a use case for either a smart label or a variant, right? Where we've got, essentially on the integration, we can key off of something that says, is the ultimate destination somewhere in Europe? Is it in the US? And then that dynamically changes the output of the label before you would actually go through and do your approval on it. So it isn't necessarily a separate design that would have to happen. It's just a variation of the same design based on, kind of where the destination of the label would be. It would be all part of the label strategy, the design strategy that a company would have, but definitely very doable.
Alrighty, so we are at time here, and just to respect everyone's schedules here and to let you guys go if you have additional meetings after this, I will begin to close down the program today. So thank you everyone for attending today's webcast. If you have any further questions, definitely feel free to submit them now before we close down. We'll provide this list of questions to our presenters today in case they would be able to follow up with some of these questions. I know we didn't get quite to all of them today, so sorry about that. So once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation today, and we just ask that you please fill that out, and we definitely appreciate your feedback. It helps us kind of build programs here in the future. You'll also receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view the recording of today's webinar. So on behalf of RAPS and our presenters from ReTech and NiceLabel today, thank you for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.